I grew up out in the country in one of those 1950s ranch houses with the living room on one end and all the bedrooms on the other and a long hallway in between. When I was little, our living room was empty except for one thing. It had a piano in it. And I loved to play the piano in there because I loved how it echoed through the walls around in that empty room. I would play and play until after supper until it was dark, and my mom called out to me that it was time for bed. And then I had to go down that long hallway to my bedroom. I lived out in the country. It was really dark. That hallway was dark. Really dark. And I was terrified of that dark. I would stand there at this end of it looking down that hall, and I would feel fear squeezing my heart, like my heart melted, like they said in the song, making it pound loudly in my chest. And I don't know what I thought was going to happen to me. I was just so scared. Scared makes you irrational. Sometimes I would call out to my mom and I would ask her to walk down the hall with me. If she walked with me, I wasn't afraid. Sometimes she would come, but not always. If Lawrence Welk was on, I could just forget it. So if I had to go alone, I would run down the hall as fast as I could and leap into my bed and wait for my heart to stop pounding. Later on, Mom would come in to say goodnight, and she would tell me that there isn't anything to be afraid of. She was wrong. There was plenty to be afraid of. There still is. Shall I tell you my list? Getting the answers wrong. Fire. Losing a pet. Being rejected. Losing a child. Violence. Getting a serious diagnosis. Losing hope. Having a breakdown. You probably have a list too. The whole world has a list. And it grieves me to see how entangled we are with our fears, so much so that we cannot bring ourselves to drag them into the light of day and thus let them go. Instead, we allow them to cripple us. It grieves me that my own fears often deafen me to the cries of those others who are perishing. But we're pretty good at being afraid as human beings. If we weren't, then "be not afraid" would not appear so many times in the Bible. But fear not is not the same as there's nothing to be afraid of. The message is not simply get over it and have some guts. Not that there isn't anything to be afraid of. There is. But in our stories, fear not is always coupled with the assurance that God is with us. Fear not because God is with us. Things might be scary, but we're not alone. Remember our stories? Don't be afraid to challenge Pharaoh, Moses. I will be with you. Don't be afraid to live in Babylon, you exiles. God is in exile with you. Don't be afraid that an angel is speaking these strange things to you, Mary. God is with you. This doesn't mean that all will turn out well. The exiles still had to live in exile. Moses had to wander in the desert and died before reaching the promised land. Mary had to suffer Joseph wanting to divorce her and had her baby in a barn and then had to watch him die on the cross. Life was still hard. Disaster happened. People died. Even Jesus died. God didn't stop him. But God was with them all. They were not alone. That was the promise. The disciples were still learning about Jesus when they got into that boat with him at night in the dark to go across that dark lake into the territory of the Gentiles, because that was what was on the other side of that lake. They were fishermen, so they might have known that a storm was possible. They might have known, too, that they might be rejected when they got to that other side, because Jews and Gentiles hated each other. And I bet they had no idea that the first thing that they would encounter upon arrival on that other side, which is the story told in the next verses after today's reading, would be a raging, naked man out of his mind, in chains and living in a cemetery. The second thing would be a herd of demon-possessed pigs hurling themselves off a cliff, followed by an angry mob running Jesus and the disciples out of town. These would have not been big selling points for the trip. The disciples went because Jesus called them. They were afraid. They didn't yet know the power of God, that even if they did perish, they would be saved. They didn't know that God brings life even out of death. Don't you care that we're perishing, they ask. Why are you afraid? Jesus responds. Don't you know that I will be with you? That I am with you, even in a storm? Even when we see the scary man in chains? Even when you're rejected? Even if you die? And he calls us too. He calls us to things so wonderful we can't even imagine them, and also some things that we dread. Sometimes things turn out to be glorious. Sometimes they're just failures. And so we have these anxieties. Can I talk about the things that make me uncomfortable? Can I get through this illness? Will I survive these loss? But God is with us in whatever boat we are in. Jesus saves, and the Spirit has come to be our comforter. These are the stories of our faith. Still, just as I needed my mom to walk with me down that long, dark hallway when I was scared, we also need each other to be the hands and feet of Jesus on this earth today. We need to be connected to each other and to ever widen our circle and bring into it all who are yearning for healing and support. We need to feed the hungry, visit the sick. We need to grieve the dead. We need to tell the truth. We need to name our sins and work for reconciliation. We need to support each other with our physical presence when one of us loses hope, and be willing to talk about uncomfortable things when that conversation is called for. We need to believe that listening to one another's pain is essential when following Jesus, and that the answer to hate and fear is mercy and forgiveness. Part of being the beloved community to which Jesus calls us is obeying his command to love one another, to tend to one another, to uphold one another, to accompany one another down our long, dark hallways, individually and collectively, to be there for those who are perishing. Who knows where Jesus is going to call us next? It may be a fantastic journey or a really scary ride across a deep, deep divide. But either way, because we belong to God and we belong to one another, we can go where we are called even when we're afraid, because we won't go alone. God will be with us, and God's people will be with us too. This is how we love one another. Thanks be to God.